In the last few videos, we've talked about single sampled instruments, but there's a downside to single sampled instruments, especially if you're going for realism. And that downside is if you just have the one sample, you're asking the computer to do a lot, stretching multiple octaves. The further you go away from the root pitch, the less quote unquote real it's going to sound. And in today's game, in today's production, it's all about realism a lot of times, especially when you're choosing a multi-sampled instrument. You want it to sound real all the way across whatever sort of range that instrument is supposed to inhabit. So we're just going to go through a few examples here and really talk about realism and how you get those results. The methods haven't changed. You're just now loading in single samples at different locations and having those trigger back on the keyboard. It's probably better to just look at this than to talk about it. And we'll begin with the Bitwig Studio sampler. And I'm just going to go ahead and bring up the acoustic piano, or hopefully bring up the acoustic piano. If necessary, I can always manually go and drag and drop it in. And so if I go into the Edit Multisample, we can now see a lot of different lanes, whereas before with just one sample, we could hold the little waveform editor down here, but now with multiple samples, we need to have a different view. And this literally corresponds to what you see on the keyboard. So if I'm playing something like a C2, we see that particular lane lights up, and we're now triggering this sample. If I go up much higher, we're now using a different group. And so forth. So the question you're asking is, well, how real is this piano? And the answer is it's not very realistic at all. We only have maybe like 10 or 15 samples to span the range of the entire instrument. Okay, that's very, very few, especially where keyboards are concerned. I like the tone of this thing, but there are a lot of factors. There are a lot of nuances to this instrument that have clearly just been forsaken for the sake of getting something convenient, quick to load, easy to play. So for example, if I hit a note soft versus very hard, it's just the same sample that's playing back, either louder or quieter based on the velocity sensitivity that's been set up. It's not multiple samples, so this instrument hasn't been sampled when somebody strikes a key softly versus when they really pound down on the key full force. It's possible to do that in this instrument by using these velocity ranges, and we could put a sample here, as many as we wanted, but they've elected not to do that in this instrument. And this brings us to the most important point of this entire video, and probably of this entire section on multi-sampled instruments, which is an instrument is only as good as its samples. Okay, just because we don't have access to a reverb or a chorus or an EQ from down inside this instrument, there's nothing stopping us from adding one on here after the fact. So this instrument, or all multi-sampled instruments, are only worth their value in samples. And of course, if you like the sound of it, that's what matters. But what you're paying for when you buy one of those 10,000, 20,000 sampled pianos are the samples themselves. All right, so that's our first example here. One other thing probably worth noting that's kind of cool is that most samplers do let you bring in some multi-sampled file types. For example, sound fonts like SF2 files. And many of you probably got into music a little bit later, but I know when I first started making music, sound fonts were still kind of like all the rage, that you could like download a sound font from the internet and you could just drag it and drop it into your sampler. And immediately kind of have that sound. And these are incredibly lightweight. They're oftentimes not even a megabyte worth of samples, and yet there's sort of like this nostalgic quality to them. Most people don't use them anymore. There's like some hip-hop artists and beat makers who you'll hear some of the same sound fonts coming up time and time again because they have a particular vibe. So realism isn't always the name of the game. So if you want to like look online and explore some sound fonts, there are some really cool free ones out there that many people have just kind of overlooked because they assume realism is better. But when it comes to making music, it's all about, the vibe and sound you're able to achieve. All right, that out of the way. Let's go with another piano here. to illustrate my next point, which is realism at a little higher value here. So if I'm playing up and down on this piano, you can actually hear right there's a release noise to the key. Happens sometimes. It doesn't happen all the time. It's probably based on how hard I'm actually hitting the key itself. So if I hit it really lightly, yeah, you can hear when I hit it harder. So this instrument clearly has multiple velocity layers, or it possibly even has a key release when something hits a certain level. So if I hit a certain velocity, it will then trigger another sample that's like, the let go of the key sample or whatever it's called. So this is no different to what we just looked at with the sampler, with the exception that we can't get to the back end of this piano and see exactly how all those waveforms have been arranged. But I know that this instrument has like gigabytes worth of samples. So it's thousands and thousands of samples, and that's for the, for the realism effect. And unfortunately, my keyboard is so far away that I can't really play anything interesting for you. And I couldn't otherwise. I'm not like a very good keyboard player. But this would be the next step up in terms of realism. All right, cool. So we've looked at the City piano. And now we're going to go and we're going to look at Kontakt. And so this is where it really gets cool and where people oftentimes, never go any deeper. As we did by creating the single sample instrument. So you now have that context to work with. But here, let's go ahead and turn off this reverb, right? Like this is just an effect. And if we go into the settings, we can see that, let's see, it's probably under insert effects. Yeah, we can see that all we have here is just this reverb and we have these different settings. So concert hall B has been loaded up, but if I wanted, I could go and I could choose something else. Like if I go to exhibition hall, I'll see how that has now changed. And so this is just something that's been programmed here inside of Kontakt. You could do this for any instrument. They've just added a very nice sort of efficient like graphic user interface to make it your life a little bit easier. But this instrument is still fundamentally, it comes down to the samples. And in this instrument, there are a ton of samples and a ton of groups within samples. Okay, so there are thousands upon thousands of samples. Well, I'm not actually sure how many there are for this instrument, but there are a lot. And we can see that if you go even further with this Kontakt and multi-sample instruments, that you have all of these different groups. So all of these different groups, and this one has a key noise as well, probably correspond to almost every note on the keyboard that has been sampled at different levels. So we can see here in terms of velocity layers, it goes way, way up there, right? There's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And this is just for the stock piano that comes with the Kontakt factory library. And we can see just how many samples end up getting triggered for even just each note. But if we wanted to, we could go in and we could look at each of these samples individually inside of the wave editor if that was something that we wanted to do. I mean, it would be absolutely crazy to actually do that, but we could if we really wanted to. Okay, so that would be a multi-sampled instrument that really is based all around realism. That being said, with Kontakt, there are some cool options. Like, yeah, I can very easily add in a reverb, add in some EQ. I can do things like add in like randomization. So this can be kind of cool sometimes. So I'm just using my typing keyboard and we're hearing the different velocity layers and the different samples that correspond to that. Then you have different options like changing the tuning system. All right, so definitely a whole nother step up in terms of realism for multi-sampled instruments. And then the other thing I thought that would be worth showing you is something that's a little bit different. If any of you guys use Nexus, right? Nexus is a very popular tool for music producers. That is what's called a Rompler, but it's literally just a sampler, right? You just bring that up. It has a bunch of samples inside of it for each preset that you use, and bang, boom, you've got it. It's ready to work with and use with some built-in effects and like filters, and you can adjust the amplitude envelope. But it's not actually a synthesizer engine. Like, you can't strip that back to an initialized state. You have to load up some kind of preset. And this AAS player is similar. I'm not 100% sure how it works because I'm not sure how big it is, like the file. I downloaded it a while ago. But what we have here are just presets from AAS instruments that we can immediately use. But there's no way for me to change anything on that. It is what it is. And if I go down, there's some pretty cool things in here, actually. Let's try romantic ARP. So we can hear like there's reverb and delay on that. I can't adjust that. I can't adjust the envelope. There's nothing I can do except play back really basically a sound font or technically a preset. But I would consider this a sampler for all intents and purposes, or just like a Rompler, because it's based on the sound itself. How good is that sound? Do you want to use that, or would you prefer not to use that? So. Right, so things like that, all sorts of different sounds in here that are pretty cool to use. But again, we have no way of kind of checking back and adjusting anything about them. They're just sounds that if we want to try to throw them into a production, we can. All right, so that is going to do it for this video on multi-sample instruments. In the next video, we'll talk about creating our own multi-sample instruments for the sake of variety, convenience, or just to get experimental and creative.